On Life and Meaning is brought to you by Blumenthal Performing Arts, celebrating its 25th year presenting the best in the performing arts, sharing and employing the arts as a major catalyst to strengthen education, building community cohesiveness, and advancing economic growth. Further support is provided by Foundation for the Carolinas, inspiring philanthropy and empowering individuals to create a better community. And by the Arts and Science Council, Charlotte-Mecklenburg's resource hub and lead advocate for the regional cultural community, providing culture for all.
And the life of faith for me is the life where God's presence is sufficient in mystery. I don't understand everything about God. I don't understand every way. I don't understand every event. But I know I'm not by myself in it.
Claude Alexander Jr. is bishop and senior pastor of the Park Church, a Baptist church headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina. Under his leadership, the Park Church has grown from one local congregation of 600 members to a global ministry of thousands of congregants with 3 locations and weekly international reach. Bishop Alexander works with government and community officials to address the community's most critical issues. He serves on many local and national religious, civic, leadership, and university boards of directors. He is the chair of the Board of Trustees of the Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary and the Second-Presiding Bishop of the Kingdom Association of Covenant Pastors. In this episode, we explore the religious and business mission of the church, racism, misogyny, and homophobia, segregation on Sunday mornings, the death of a brother, a crisis of faith, living with mystery, and the love of God. I'm Mark Paris, and this is On Life and Meaning. Bishop, welcome.
Thank you.
Bishop, what is the Park?
The Park Church is a 106-year-old congregation, primarily African American. Started as a prayer band of people 106 years ago and has grown into a multifaceted ministry that seeks to address the whole person, seeks to take the incarnation seriously.
What has been notable about its history?
Its resiliency. The history of the church is fraught with challenges such as fire, such as displacement, church splits, and through it all, those individuals have been able to push through, rebound, adjust, and continue to grow and flourish, all while believing in the sufficiency of God.
There are many churches in our city. What distinguishes the Park?
One thing that distinguishes it is its risk tolerance. In 1990, as it was searching for a pastor, it was willing to throw away everything that it stated that it wanted. It wanted somebody 35, wanted somebody married, wanted somebody with 5 years of pastoral experience, and it called someone single, 26, with only 3 years. That has been shown throughout its history. Now, a lot of times what we would call risk is also a synonym for faith and belief. So that has been an evolution. It started as one congregation that met in one place that had one service. And then it grew to one place that had 4 services, and then one congregation that met in 2 places that had 4 services, and then one congregation that now owns 3 properties, each of which has a worship offering. as well as a digital offering. That virtual community is global in scope. And so on a Sunday, more people may be listening digitally than are actually in a room or on any of the three campuses.
How large is the congregation today?
It depends on who you ask. Multiple thousands, much more than one person can service. And so we're grateful for the many individuals, both employed and lay, that help make the ministry work.
Bishop, today we are speaking in something called the Park Expo and Convention Center. What is this place that we are in?
Formerly known as the Charlotte Merchandise Mart, this place is a multifaceted ministry hub. It is the place certainly where worship goes on. It is a place where counseling goes on, youth activities, outreach to the community, a charter middle and high school. It is a place where trade shows continue to be done, conferences, and in September we will be launching a U.S.-Africa trade hub here in this facility.
Bishop, what is the role of the park in the world? How do you see the mission of this church?
Our mission, formally stated, is to extend the love, the life, and lordship of Jesus Christ to every person in every way, in every time, and every place that we're given the opportunity. We see our role as being incarnational, and by that, seeking to be a redemptive presence in the world, whether that is through the traditional things that we do by way of worship, or the business things that we do in terms of hosting and serving, or simply in the provision of space for others to fulfill the call that God has made upon their lives, not just locally, but globally.
Does the business enterprise ever compromise the religious mission?
There are tensions in terms of what one seeks to do and how one is perceived in the doing of it. But for us, there is no secular, sacred divide. Everything has sacred implications. And so the question is how one is redemptive, even in the midst of tension.
Well, how is the church redemptive in its business practices?
So, one, we seek to be fair. We seek to serve in a way where people feel a difference. We try to be as flexible without being taken advantage of. Yeah.
Bishop, how is the church doing with its core mission? And how is the church doing with this tension between its business enterprise and its religious mission?
Well, the church is navigating the uncharted waters of the impact of social media and digitization in terms of what people expect and how people relate to it and its work. For instance, the unintended consequence of putting up a signal of our worship services then gives someone the option of either coming to the building or remaining at home. Another unintended consequence is how one views one's relationship in terms of the church, whether as a member or as a consumer, as a contributor, or as one who just consumes the religious content that it provides. Now, in that respect, then, even in what we would call its religious mission, there is always a business aspect in terms of product and the person receiving and relating to it. In terms of the more formal business of the Park Expo and Conference Center, because it's a separate entity, that is growing and increasing. So There has always been within the black church an entrepreneurial bent, because the church, the black church, has always been more than the religious center of a people. It has had to provide for more than just the religious instruction. It has had to provide educational opportunity. It has had to provide entrepreneurial opportunity. It has had to incent business formation in its history. You know, when one looks at the history of blacks in America, schools, businesses, many institutions started right out of the church.
Bishop, the Park is a church that serves primarily the African American community.
Sure.
Is the work of ministering to the African American community any different than serving any other demographic?
The closest similarity to the black church would probably be the Jewish synagogue. The Jewish synagogue is not just the place of religious instruction for the Jew, but it is also the place of cultural support, affirmation, and that is what the black church historically and still contemporaneously is in many ways. It is the one institution owned, and that word own means there's a lot in that word, by black people. It is the one place of sanctuary for a minority that still experiences marginalization, and is the place where that is not felt as much.
Well, probably not the only group that feels marginalization.
Exactly right.
You can think of folks from all over the world who are here in the United States who have their own churches who find sanctuary in their religion.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And so the ethnic minority churches, by and large, have that same experience and fulfill that same mission.
Bishop, what is top of mind for you these days?
Wow. 2019 is an epic moment in the life of our country. It is the 400th anniversary of the transatlantic slave trade. It predates the formation of our nation by roughly 150 years and helps serve as an understanding of why the issue of race is so problematic for us, because it served as the amniotic fluid in which our founders wrote those glorious documents and could still hold slaves, and they themselves felt tension and sought to resolve it in different ways. But it gives us an opportunity to not only reflect on our past, but also look at our present, and more importantly, reimagine what our future can be.
How is this concern showing up for you in the work that you were doing?
Well, it's showing up in a variety of ways. I have accepted that part of my calling is to serve as a cultural translator. More and more, I am called into majority white spaces to be able to speak to the matter of race, whether it is with a good friend of mine, Chip Ingram, and Venture Church out on the West Coast, or with white organizations such as Christianity Today, being able to speak to this matter. One, because there's just an ignorance of the history, and therefore a misperception of the contemporary manifestations, because we don't know the history, and history tends to repeat itself. And I believe that is part of where we are today.
And what is it that you are saying to these predominantly white audiences?
Well, one, there's a need to know history. I'll give you several examples. First of all, whenever I ask people, what was the first state to legalize slavery? Immediately they think of Virginia or South Carolina. Well, the first state was Massachusetts. When I ask people in terms of what state made it illegal for a person of color to testify against a white person. One might say Mississippi or Alabama. Well, no, that's California. And so the two most liberal, quote-unquote, progressive states have this racialized history. So it's not just north-south. It's east and west throughout the country. When we talk about wealth and the generational transfer of wealth, well, what started in the U.S. were two pieces of legislation: Social Security, that gave benefits to everyone except those who were migrant and domestic workers. Well, who were the migrant and domestic workers? People of color. The GI Bill, which provided educational and economic and home ownership incentives and funds, were given to white soldiers, but soldiers of color were denied those opportunities. So the structural things that benefited across generations but were denied others. Just knowing that history and therefore being able to connect some dots.
Is knowing the history enough?
It's the beginning. It's the beginning. Because you have to understand that this is not just individual, but it's institutional. It's structural.
Given that history, what is our responsibilities to each other today?
You mentioned the correct word: responsibility. Because normally when we have these discussions, there's this sense of blame, of guilt, and fault. My white friends would say, well, that's not my fault. I'm not racist. I haven't done anything. And it's neither of our faults. But it is equally our responsibility. If we understand that through no fault of our own, certain benefits and burdens were conferred upon us simply because of the race into which we were born, which was neither of our faults, then we can also say it is our collective responsibility. And our responsibilities are, one, to know, to be aware. Number two, with that, then become more curious and sensitive. And one may say, well, curious and sensitive to what? Well, curious and, sensitive to the privilege that one may have and the lack of privilege that another may not have. Sensitive to who's missing in a room where one sits, or if they're in the room, who has agency in the room and who doesn't.
Is there a further responsibility in terms of policy to make up for these deficits and disparities between folks?
Absolutely. Again, just in terms of history, usually when one talks about affirmative action, one thinks of that as a quote-unquote liberal Democrat program. Well, the history is that was begun by Richard Nixon, a Republican, one who also used a Southern strategy in 1968 to get elected and solidified disaffected Democrats for the Republican Party. Well, that was what he did. He also set in place what we call affirmative action, which was a structural redressing. And progress has been made. But as we know in our own city, ranking 50th out of 50 in terms of upward mobility, the two driving factors being segregation and social capital. And those things have a tie, have a connection. When I now recognize these two driving factors, segregation and social capital, what's my responsibility? Well, my responsibility then becomes, how do I seek to become more integrated in my associations, in my interactions, which then helps build the social capital, But it takes intentionality. It takes a willingness to risk. It takes a willingness, yes, to even sacrifice comfort, convenience, and perhaps even cash. The Good Samaritan parable is all about, one, a willingness to go further in proximity than others did, a willingness to have one's assumptions from a distance challenged and corrected, a willingness to lean in and see the person for who one is, and then a willingness to inconvenience oneself, to stop, to put this person on the donkey that you were riding, to be willing to walk, to go perhaps where you weren't intended on going, to an inn, to bandage the person up, to tell the innkeeper, here's some money, and whatever, this doesn't cover, when I come back, I'll take care of it. All of those things are things that we are challenged to do as well.
I love this notion that our response to our racial history is the Good Samaritan parable,
Yeah.
because we do have this responsibility to the least among us.
Yeah. Well, and when one understands that Jesus evokes the notion of race and ethnicity in that parable, because the word Samaritan was not a positive term, it was a pejorative term dealing with those whose blood was mixed.
Bishop, would you like to see greater race consciousness in America or less?
I don't know if consciousness is the right word. I think the word that I would seek to use is appreciation and affirmation. So, for instance, when someone says to me, that when they look at me, they don't see a black man, they mean well, but what they don't understand is that there is an undeniable part of me that either they don't see or they don't know what to do with. That would just be like me telling my wife, when I look at you, I don't see a woman. Well, there's no way that I could deny her gender. And what I should not be is denying her gender. I should be affirming. I should be celebrating the fact that she is a woman. And likewise, we should be able to see a person of color, whatever that color may be or that ethnicity may be, and say, I celebrate that. I affirm that.
Bishop, you just mentioned gender. I'd like to read something to you. This is an article by Ebony Turman, a Baptist minister, who says, Black women are the black church, period. Black women make up 85 to 90% of black church membership. But while the gifts and labor of black women are consistently exploited by black churches, they are regularly excluded from leadership. And black male preachers demonize and paralyze black women and black girls every day. She goes on to say, while the history of white Christianity in the Americas has been a primary source of black death and deprivation, like white Christians, black men in the black church kill black women figuratively every day. Is criticism that the black church is sexist and misogynist fair or unfair?
Mark, what you read is a sad reality. One of the things that I think is helpful in questions concerning the black church is that the black church is not a monolithic entity. It is comprised of a variety of denominations and reformations whose positions on the role of women and other things is as diverse as any other population. There are strands of Methodism and Pentecostalism that have been quite progressive in the role and place of women from their very inception, and others that have not. As I look at my own personal biography, my mother a psychiatrist by occupation and training, there was a clear call to the ministry and to preach upon her life early. But she happened to grow up in a time and denomination that did not recognize or affirm that. And therefore, she channeled all of that passion, that ability, those gifts into the practice of psychiatry. Later on in life, she was able to begin a ministers in training program under my pastorate. Because of her dementia, she was unable to complete it, but I am glad that I was able to affirm that call upon her life. In our congregation, the role and place of women in ministry is affirmed. We ordain women. The past 3 executive ministers, that is the position immediately under me, has been filled by women, and yet I am still aware that the opportunity for women in senior leadership is not what it should be across the board. I would also say that in talking with my female pastor colleagues, whether Dr. Cynthia Hale of the Ray of Hope Church or Dr. Gina Stewart of Christ Missionary Baptist Church in Memphis, one of the things that they shared with me is that some of the individuals who are most resistant to their leadership are other women. And therefore, this problem, these barriers, are not just those put up by men, but also women. I believe that that is reflective of how deep this goes in our society and how much more work we have to do.
There is also a criticism that the Black church is homophobic. Fair or unfair?
Your question about the church and homophobia is a layered question and can't be answered with a simple yes or no. I would probably say yes and no. To be sure, there have been too many instances where the language, the tone, and the actions of people representing the church in their view have been injurious, have been harmful, have been hurtful, and perhaps, yes, even hateful. And those occasions come out of, yes, a fear, a lack of understanding. And for those that have happened in our city in the recent years, I, on behalf of the church, would seek to apologize. But I would also say that there are those who find themselves in tension as it relates to being faithful to what they believe to be the consistent biblical view of marriage, being that between one man and one woman, and the contemporary times in which we live. There are many, and I would be included among them, who believe that what is consistent in Scripture is that of a man and a woman in marriage, but who also believe that no one should face violence, harassment, or unjust discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, who would look to the model found in Utah where those two things are held in healthy tension. And I would hope that living in a pluralistic society, we are able to affirm that individuals can hold these things in tension, may come to different decisions as it relates to them, but still have respect, admiration, and support of one another. There are gay and lesbian members of our congregation who, knowing my position, still choose to remain as members. We live in tension together, and I would hope that they do so because they know that even though we may differ in terms of my view as it relates to marriage, that they know that I love them, that as their pastor, I will care for them, that I will be there when they need me. I am also grateful that there are pastors who hold a different view, and therefore I am able to recommend those individuals, those pastors, those churches, those ministries, should those individuals desire to be in a different place.
Do you think future generations here at the park may look back and say you were on the wrong side of history?
They may. They may. In terms of how history will judge me as it relates to this, I would hope that people would know that I am one who sought to be faithful to the scriptures as I understood them, and yet be sensitive to the needs and place of people as I find them.
Bishop, historically, the Christian church has offered love and forgiveness, but has also been a place of conflict, war, and oppression. Why is that?
I want to first of all, again, let's start from the point that the church is made up of people who are flawed, from the pulpit to the door. There is no infallible, perfect person alive today. And therefore, there is no perfect church. So let's start with that. 2, the arc of the history of the people of God, from if you want to start with Adam, or if you want to start with Abraham, wherever you want to start, you have seen humanity at its best, and you've seen humanity at its worst. The sovereignty of God, the belief in the sovereignty of God, is that both the best and the worst of humanity is bracketed by this God who is good, this God whose purposes of justice and righteousness are being worked out through people who seek to be sensitive and faithful to him, who shine in their moments when they are most sensitive to how this God reveals himself. And yet, in the next moment, cannot be so. It's Simon Peter, who, when Jesus asks, "Who do you say that I, the Son of Man, am?" says, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says, "Blessed are you. Flesh and blood has not revealed it unto you." But as Jesus starts talking about his suffering, that same person says, "Not so." And Jesus says, "Get thee behind me, Satan, for you are thinking not of the things of God, but the things of man." That's the church.
The same Peter who denied him 3 times.
And the same Peter who denied him 3 times, and yet who on the day of Pentecost stands and proclaims him 3,000. Yeah.
Bishop, one would think that Sunday morning would be the most integrated time in America when the beloved community comes together. Instead, Sunday morning is the most segregated time in America. Why is that?
Well, number one, there's not one reason why. There are multiple reasons why. For many persons of color or ethnic minorities, their worship place is the one place where they are not the minority, where they can be the majority. And unless one has ever been a minority in a very real sense, one does not know how important that is. So that's one reason. I would venture also to say the flip side is also true. And that is that those who are in the majority in every aspect of their lives don't want to be the minority in this one part of their lives. You will find ethnic and racial minorities more in predominantly white congregations than you will find whites in ethnically and racially minority places. And there's one reason for that. It's not worship style, because it can be apples to apples. It's not doctrine. It is simply the fact that when I'm not a minority in any other aspect of my life, I'm not really going to be likely to choose to be a minority in that one. I think where there has been the greatest success is not in a 105-year-old church that's been black trying to become, no. The greatest degree of success has been those who have started from the very beginning with a multiracial, multi-ethnic leadership and membership.
If white folks started showing up at the park, just more and more white folks sitting in the pews and volunteering, would you welcome that? And do you think your congregation would welcome that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So a good friend of mine.
Really?
Yes. No. If you were to ask many of the white people who have visited, how they felt, you would be surprised to hear them talk about welcomed, accepted. But I understand that even those who are my friends, who may come and visit, aren't necessarily going to become members. That's just a part of it.
Bishop, what's next for the park?
Well, in the immediate sense, we will be hosting a summit here at the Park Expo and Conference Center in commemoration of the 400th anniversary of the transatlantic slave trade that will be engaging the continent of Africa and the African diaspora in North America in a process that seeks to reconnect, reconcile, reclaim what's been lost in the past 400 years, and begin to reimagine a future. I'm going to be asking three big questions. What's the history? What's the history on the continent? What's the history here? What's the present? We don't have an awareness of either of those, history or present. For instance, 7 of the fastest growing economies in the world are on the continent. And the continent does not understand that just for black Americans alone, the gross buying power last year was $1.2 trillion present. The third question, what are the opportunities for the future in terms of partnership? We will also be launching the Park Expo and Conference Center's U.S.-Africa Trade Hub that will provide space for African continental businesses to have a U.S. presence, that will provide opportunity for American businesses who seek to do partnership with them either as they grow their U.S. presence or on the continent. And the third opportunity will be the opportunity for distribution in the U.S. of African goods and products. And the fact that the African Union, which is the continent of Africa's version of the European Union, they have adopted this fully. So Charlotte has 2 unique opportunities. One, to have the most significant observance of the 400th anniversary. And more importantly, to be the portal through which Africa does business in the U.S. and the U.S. can do business in Africa.
Bishop, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi.
And how would you describe Jackson growing up?
Well, the Jackson that I grew up in was initial desegregation. And so there was the racial tension. There still was a degree of animus. I remember because we moved to Jackson in the summer of 1968 from D.C. First grade, I was in an all-black environment, and then in the second grade, I was in an all-white environment. I remember the first time being called the N-word. I didn't know what that meant. I came home and I talked to my mom, and I remember the look on my mom's face as she then had to interpret and translate what that meant, and knew that the innocence that her son had, he would no longer have. Now, the kid who called me the N-word in the second grade, in my 11th grade year, was a kid who voted for me to be vice president of the whole school. And so there was progress. The thing about Mississippi, unlike perhaps Charlotte, is that at least people were honest. Charlotte is polite. That's what shocked everybody when Putnam came out with the first study on social capital in 2000, how we could be 39th out of 40 in terms of interracial trust because we were so polite, and yet the survey says something else. In Mississippi, you knew where you stood, and you were able then to recognize the progress when you saw it.
What was important in your family?
In my family, my stepfather, who raised me, helped desegregate the American Medical Association. He was very instrumental in the civil rights movement in terms of providing the medical care during the marches. He was also a part of the community health program, developing that whole system that we now know of as community health centers. But also a strong person of faith, as was my mom. And so, on the one hand, there's this underpinning of spirituality and religious commitment, but also community involvement. There was no separation in terms of one's occupation and one's vocation. Each fed and informed the other.
Bishop, in fact, your stepfather was the doctor to Martin Luther King.
Yes, so he would be assigned to Dr. King whenever Dr. King was in Mississippi, and he still thinks a lot of that.
Brothers or sisters?
I have 2 sisters. I had 1 brother.
Bishop, you felt a calling as a teenager.
Sure.
What was that calling, and how were you sure about it?
The calling that I would describe would be a growing awareness that increased in terms of volume and weight. You know, again, growing up in a home where the summer jobs were at the office, doing lab work, shooting x-rays, or doing inpatient stuff for my mom and billing, one would think medicine. But there was this sense beginning about 8th, 9th grade that increased in the volume in terms of just sound and the weight in terms of awareness that, yeah, you could do medicine, but there's something else that God is calling you to do. And through the assistance of my home pastor and my mother's brothers, who first did everything that they could to dissuade me because they didn't want it to be family related. But once they saw that it was authentic, then they did everything that they could to support me.
Was there a moment where you felt, this is who I need to be?
It was the beginning of my senior year in high school. Yep. I was the guest speaker at our youth day, was unable to show up. And that Friday, my pastor asked me, I said, sure. And that Sunday, there was a sense, this is what the Lord has for me.
Bishop, your mom went to Howard as an undergrad and Howard Medical School.
Right.
And your stepdad went to Howard Medical School.
Yeah.
And yet you chose not to go to Howard. You went somewhere else. Where else did you go?
I went to Morehouse College. And the reasons were, number one, there was and perhaps still is no better place that has as its specific mission the development of males, and particularly African American males, for leadership in their given fields, whatever it may be. That's number one. The second thing is that Morehouse had a tradition, particularly in the preparation of young men for ministry. Now, the tie as it relates to Howard is that Howard's glory days began under the presidency of a Morehouse man, Mordecai Wyatt Johnson. So there's the tie.
I'm sure that's not the first time you've mentioned it.
Not at all.
Bishop, you went to Morehouse College. You're a Morehouse man.
Yep.
And you studied philosophy.
Sure.
Why philosophy?
Well, the initial reason was because that was one of the things that Dr. Martin Luther King studied. But more importantly, the history of philosophy and theology parallel in many ways. And many of the early Christian theologians were also philosophers. And so there is this parallel lanes and intersection. The second thing is philosophy teaches you to think. It exposes you to the various streams of thought and belief, religious and otherwise, that our civilizations have had, and therefore better prepares you to be able to sit down and have an informed conversation with other people, whether they are like you or different from you. Yeah.
Bishop, you did study philosophy. Have you ever had a crisis of faith?
I've had several. I don't believe that one can authentically grow in terms of depth and dimension without having questions. The time of my discerning my call to ministry was also during a time of crisis in my faith and belief, where I doubted the very care of God, where I entertained thoughts of ending my life due to, at that time, the absence and the intentional inactivity of my biological father in my life. I questioned the care of God and my value as a person early. But it was through that God made himself known in a very powerful way. And God's care and God's concern for me and purpose for my life was established. That was at the age of 16 and 17 years. Fast forward to 2011. And my brother, 39 years of age, was diagnosed with squamous cell cancer of the tongue, which by all accounts was a treatable and survivable cancer. He went through the surgery, which by all regards was successful, the resection that happened in October and November of 2011. In February of 2012, he did the requisite chemo, which was a follow-up. And then in March, began to develop some fevers that doctors thought were infection and treated as such. And by April, mid-April, what they thought was fever due to infection, they discovered was fever due to tumor spread. And on May 4th, my brother died. In a span of 7 months, I watched a vibrant, progressive, Wall Street mogul type go from energetic to dying. My baby brother, I watched die. And there were all sorts of questions that I had. Didn't he deserve more? And more honestly, didn't I deserve more? It was a hard time, and as you can tell, it's still tender. A lot of anger, and the anger was due to the notion of vulnerability. What God did not keep from happening to me and to mine. And my brother was just one example of that. The most painful, to be sure, but not the only. What I discovered in this life with God is that the life with God is not one where every question is going to be answered in the way that you ask it. There's some why questions you'll never get answers to. But you will be told who God is. And the life of faith for me is the life where God's presence is sufficient in mystery. I don't understand everything about God. I don't understand every way. I don't understand every event. But I know I'm not by myself in it. And I know that God will give me enough for it. I think that for the Christian, the notion of the resurrection provides us a hope. The Bible says an anchor for our souls that causes us to believe that all of the disjointed things of life will find their ultimate resolution in a day that's beyond us. And that we will see fully what we only see in part now.
Bishop, what is it that you want people to know?
Ultimately, I would want people to know that, one, a relationship with God is one where God's love for us, that there is this flexibility, this boundlessness in God's love for us that there is no thought, no feeling, no question that we could ever have, one that will change his love for us, that he can hear it, he can take it, and yet hold and nurture and love us the same. That God did not love me less in my questions and in my anger. Perhaps our intimacy grew because there was this trust in God's love that created the space for me to be open and honest. I really believe that intimacy comes about by greater transparency. And transparency comes through a trust in the unchanging nature of the other person. And so I would want people to know that this God is a God who is unchanging in his position, in his disposition, in his person and purpose towards you and towards me. And that this God invites us into an ever-growing relationship of intimacy and trust.
Thank you for your time today, Bishop.
Sure.
Bishop Alexander is senior pastor of the Park Church. He earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in philosophy from Morehouse College, a Master of Divinity Degree from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and a Doctor of Ministry degree from Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary. And now, a personal word. The morning I met Bishop Alexander for this conversation, life and death events in our lives blurred together. I met Bishop Alexander on a Saturday morning outside the Park Expo and Conference Center near Independence Boulevard in Charlotte. I had made left and right turns trying to find my way into a massive empty parking lot. It was a blistering hot day. I walked up to the 5-story Expo Center, and every door I checked was locked. There was no one in sight. I called Bishop Alexander on his cell phone, and he assured me he was just around the corner. Bishop Alexander is a tall, lean fellow with a gracious manner and a gravelly, calming voice. He has the gait of a confident man. He walked me into the Expo Center, a cavernous space that was once the Charlotte Merchandise Mart, and is now a multifaceted religious and business enterprise zone. Signs declaring the mission of the church were posted throughout the complex. Bishop Alexander guided me to his 5th-floor office, where a large, expressive painting of Jesus looked over our conference table. I set up my microphones, and our conversation began about the history of the park, the legacy of racism in America, charges of misogyny and homophobia in the church, an opportunity for trade and commerce with Africa, and his call to ministry. Then the conversation became quiet and personal. Bishop Alexander shared a crisis of faith that followed the death of his brother. His voice became measured. He bowed his head. He wiped away tears. His brother died from cancer at the age of 39. Bishop Alexander said how tender he felt. He talked about loss and anger. Unspoken was that God had forsaken him. I listened in silence. There is something sacred when a person shares themselves honestly. The space between is charged. Bishop Alexander went on to share what he wanted people to know, that life with God is one in which questions may not be answered, but one comes to know who God is, and God's presence becomes sufficient in mystery. He added that the resurrection provides hope that all of the disjointed things of life will find their resolution in a day when we will see fully what we only see in part now. Trust in God's love creates space for intimacy. Bishop Alexander's memories about his brother brought up feelings I have about my dad. My dad was a caring father, but he was not intrusive in our emotional lives. He was 46 years old when I was born. We were generations apart and also of different cultures. He was Brazilian and I was American. My brother and sisters and I experienced a lot of drama at home. We moved constantly and grew up in a house where my parents often clashed. I mention all this because there were years when my dad and I were estranged. We did not talk to each other for months. In one instance, 2 years went by before we spoke. Then I would knock on the door of my parents' apartment, and he would open it, and I would kiss my dad on his cheek in the Brazilian way, and that kiss would forgive whatever had happened, and we would go on and eat dinner at the table and watch heavyweight boxing and meet the press. In the spring of 1992, when I was 30 years old and my dad was 76, I began tape recording conversations with my dad. My father was a natural storyteller. He told the same stories over and over again, but somehow each time they felt fresh and poignant and funny. I wanted to record his Brazilian accented voice and preserve the memory of his extraordinary life, as well as those stories. Over the next 3 months, we talked at his apartment or mine in Miami. I would push down the cassette recorder and ask him questions. We recorded 12 hours of conversation about the low points and high points and turning points of our family. I then transcribed every word, typing in the hunt and peck way I saw my dad type on his old Corolla typewriter. I bound the transcription of my conversations with my dad into 3 volumes, and I gave a set to my brother and sisters and my mom. I wrote this forward. This is the story of one man's life. It is offered as much to reveal him as it is to reveal us. It is an inventory of impressions on a shelf, of photographs of a mind. Moments are fleeting, elusive to capture, but moments shared are the stuff of lives. Here is a reflection and a shared memory of a life and of us. At the end of Volume 3, I included a personal letter my dad wrote to all his children, sharing his insights about each of us and his love for all of us. It is the most tender letter one can imagine. 7 years later, I moved to Charlotte. On August 20th, 1999, my sister called me with news that my mom and dad had been in a terrible car accident. They were taken to the hospital in critical condition. My dad was 82 years old, but had survived every health scare. No one in my family had ever died. I was sure he would make it, and I did not travel to Florida, focusing on my new startup business instead. I spoke with my dad on the phone, and he told me from his hospital bed that he would be fine. In the early dawn of September 10th, the phone rang at my home. I could sense in the tone of the rings that I was about to hear news I did not want to hear. My sister was on the line. She told me our dad had died. I remember crying out this guttural cry. I spoke at my dad's service. My voice broke several times as I read out loud the letter he had written to his children. My father wrote, "A father with children like mine is very, very rich indeed. Thank you, O Lord, for anointing me with so much love. My children have been an endless source of inspiration, motivation, and strength to face the tribulations and trials of my life. And despite my humble position, I am the victor. I realize I could have been a better father. I could have provided my children with more security and counseling to improve their lot. In a way, I am satisfied, for they are well. They are exactly who I felt they would become and have fulfilled the message each of them brought into this world." That was my dad, and I miss him. This podcast marks the 20th anniversary year of when my dad died. I don't know where the impulse to do things comes from. I don't know if we will see fully what we only see in part now. I trust that we are all connected by love. This is Mark Paris, and you've been listening to On Life and Meaning. Additional support for this podcast is provided by the UNC College of Arts and Architecture celebrating a decade of creative education in the arts and design. Thank you to our funding partners and to my teammates, Andy Go, producer of the show, and to Chris Curriton, art and media director. This is how you can help. Please write a review on iTunes. It helps us grow our audience. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. And become a patron. We are on Patreon, a crowdsourcing platform that allows you to support what you value at a level you choose. Visit us also on our website on lifeandmeaning.com. Thank you for listening.